Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Alabama. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The waters of Mobile Bay have always carried secrets. In the year 1856, when the cotton trade was at its peak and the dark stain of human bondage marked the South, a vessel called the Meridian departed from the docks under the command of a captain whose name would later be whispered with a peculiar mix of fear and contempt. According to the maritime records of Alabama's coastal authority, the ship was destined for New Orleans with a cargo that included 200 enslaved individuals. It was a common sight in those troubled times, a routine journey along the Gulf Coast that should have taken no more than 3 days. Yet neither the ship, its captain, nor a single soul aboard ever arrived at their destination. The disappearance created little immediate concern. Communication was slow, and delays were expected. It was only after 2 weeks of silence that questions began to arise. The trading company that had chartered the vessel, Whitaker & Sons, filed an official inquiry with the Harbour Master's office in Mobile. The document, preserved in county records and later discovered in 1861, noted only that property of considerable value had been lost. The humanity aboard warranted no mention beyond their monetary worth. Initial searches revealed nothing. The waters between Mobile and New Orleans showed no sign of wreckage. No bodies washed ashore. It was as though the Meridian had sailed into a void. The strange circumstances might have faded into historical obscurity like so many maritime mysteries of the era, were it not for what transpired in a small fishing village 10 miles south of Mobile Bay, in what was then known as Oyster Point. According to the parish registry of St. Anne's Church, a man appeared in the community approximately 4 days after the Meridian's departure. He gave his name as Thomas Miller and claimed to be a merchant from Charleston. There was nothing particularly remarkable about him, save for his apparent wealth. He purchased a modest property on the outskirts of the village, paying in gold coins that the local banker noted in his ledger as Spanish doubloons of unusual mint. Miller kept to himself, though he employed several locals to make improvements to his property. What they built, according to tax assessments filed in the spring of 1857, was described as a storage facility of considerable dimension, partially subterranean in nature. For nearly a year, Miller lived quietly in Oyster Point. He made few acquaintances and traveled frequently, often disappearing for weeks at a time. The only peculiarity noted by neighbors was the sound of activity from his property during the night, the movement of carts, muffled voices, and on occasion, what one neighbor described in a letter to her sister as wailing that might have been the wind had it not carried such human desperation. In December of 1857, approximately 13 months after the disappearance of the Meridian, a storm of unusual ferocity struck the Gulf Coast. The hurricane devastated Oyster Point, destroying most structures in the village. When residents returned to salvage what remained, they found Miller's property abandoned. More disturbing, however, was what the storm had revealed. The storage facility had partially collapsed, exposing a network of underground chambers. Inside, local authorities discovered evidence of habitation, crude pallets, chains fixed to the walls, and implements that suggested both restraint and punishment. Most disturbing of all was a journal recovered from what appeared to be living quarters separate from the chambers. The document, preserved now only in fragments transcribed by a court clerk named William Foster, contained entries that suggested a connection to the vanished Meridian. The handwriting, later compared to ship manifests, bore striking similarities to that of the missing captain. The journal spoke of a venture of independent enterprise and freedom from the constraints of commerce. It detailed the careful planning of a theft, not just of a vessel, but of human cargo valued at over $150,000 in the currency of the day. There were mentions of Confederates in Oyster Point, of preparations made months in advance, and of a plan to transport the enslaved individuals gradually to Florida. where they would be sold to plantation owners with whom the writer had made arrangements. The most chilling passages, however, concerned the writer's attitude toward those in his custody. "They are mine now," one entry read. "Not property to be delivered, but souls over whom I hold absolute dominion." Another described punishments inflicted for perceived disobedience, written with a detachment that suggested neither sadism nor remorse, merely the clinical observations of a man who viewed his actions as entirely reasonable. The final entries documented increasing paranoia. The writer spoke of eyes watching from the darkness and whispers of rebellion. He noted that 3 of his captives had died, 1 from illness, 2 from what he described as necessary correction. Their bodies, according to the journal, were disposed of in the waters of the bay under cover of darkness. The discovery prompted an investigation by county authorities. Based on the evidence found, a warrant was issued for the arrest of the Meridian's captain, whose name was revealed in the documentation to be James Whittaker, a relation of the very family that owned the trading company, a detail conspicuously absent from earlier inquiries. But James Whittaker was never found. The chambers beneath the property yielded no human remains, though iron restraints and other evidence suggested that many people had indeed been held there. Records from neighboring counties revealed an unusual pattern in the months following the Meridian's disappearance. Several plantations in the Florida Panhandle reported purchasing enslaved workers from a trader whose description matched that of Thomas Miller. The trader claimed his merchandise came from the dissolution of estates in Georgia, providing documentation that was later determined to be falsified. The investigation stalled as the tensions preceding the Civil War consumed public attention. The case file was archived in 1860, marked unresolved, and effectively forgotten as the nation tore itself apart. It might have remained buried in administrative obscurity were it not for an academic researcher named Elizabeth Danfield, who in 1963 was examining county records for a study on maritime commerce in the antebellum South. Danfield's discovery of the case led her to search for descendants of those potentially connected to the incident. Her inquiries led her to a nursing home in Birmingham, where she interviewed Eleanor Whittaker, then 94 years old, and the last living grandchild of Charles Whittaker, who had been the patriarch of Whittaker and Sons in 1856. The interview, recorded on magnetic tape and transcribed for Danfield's research, revealed family knowledge never documented in official records. According to Eleanor, her grandfather had indeed conspired with his son James to steal their own shipment. The plan, born of financial desperation as the company faced bankruptcy, was to collect the insurance on the lost vessel while selling the human cargo through private channels. Grandfather never spoke of it directly, Eleanor told Danfield, but on his deathbed, he told my father that James had betrayed them. He was supposed to deliver the proceeds from the sales, but he kept everything. Grandfather said they should never have trusted James. He had always been strange, even as a boy. He collected things, birds he'd killed, insects pinned to boards. He watched people when he thought no one was looking. My father said that toward the end, Grandfather would wake screaming, saying that James was standing at the foot of his bed, dripping wet and smelling of the sea, though James had not been seen in nearly 40 years. Eleanor further revealed that in 1895, nearly 4 decades after the Meridian vanished, a man matching James Whittaker's description was reported in New Orleans. By then, he would have been in his 60s. According to a letter sent to Charles Whittaker by a former business associate, the man was working as a keeper in a private asylum. The associate recognized him despite the passage of years and made inquiries. The man denied being James Whittaker, but reportedly fled the city shortly thereafter. No further sightings were ever confirmed. The researchers' efforts to trace what happened to the enslaved individuals aboard the Meridian yielded little conclusive evidence. Records of sales in Florida identified only 23 people who might have originated from the vessel. Their subsequent fates vanished into the cruel anonymity forced upon enslaved Americans. What happened to the others? Whether they perished in the underground chambers of Oyster Point, were sold elsewhere without documentation, or met some other end, remains unknown. Elizabeth Danfield's research was never published. According to correspondence found among her personal effects after her death in 1967, she intended to write a comprehensive account of the case. However, her notes indicated increasing difficulty in accessing certain records. Several letters expressed frustration with local historical societies that suddenly claimed certain documents were missing or unavailable for review. Her final diary entry, dated 3 weeks before her death from what was officially recorded as a cerebral hemorrhage, stated, "Someone does not want this story told. I received another call last night, just breathing on the line. The same car has been parked across from my apartment for 3 days. Tomorrow I'm taking everything to Stanley at the university. He'll know what to do with it. No materials were ever received by anyone named Stanley at the University of Alabama, where Danfield had been conducting her research. Her notes, correspondence, and recordings were found in her apartment after her death, but the tape containing the interview with Eleanor Whitaker was missing. The case file she had assembled disappeared from county archives sometime in the 1970s, with only a transfer receipt remaining. The destination noted on the receipt, the State Historical Commission, has no record of ever receiving the materials. In 1959, years before Danfield's research, construction workers excavating for a commercial development near the historical location of Oyster Point uncovered a series of underground chambers. According to newspaper reports, the chambers contained rusted metal fixtures attached to the walls and floors. The discovery halted construction briefly, but after inspection by local authorities, the chambers were demolished and construction continued. No archaeological assessment was conducted and no remains were reported found. However, a worker involved in the excavation later claimed in an interview with a local historian that they had uncovered at least a dozen skeletal remains that were quietly removed and disposed of to avoid delaying the project. The commercial building erected on the site housed various businesses over the decades until it was destroyed by Hurricane Frederick in 1979. The land remained undeveloped thereafter, becoming overgrown and eventually incorporated into a coastal preservation area. Today, nothing marks the location where Thomas Miller, likely Captain James Whitaker, once held captive the people he had stolen. The waters of Mobile Bay continue to rise and fall with the tides, concealing whatever evidence might remain of the Meridian and its final voyage. Local fishermen occasionally report that certain areas of the bay yield no catch, the waters strangely still and cold even on warm days. Some claim to have heard sounds carrying across the water on windless nights, the rhythmic creak of wooden beams under strain, the clink of chains, voices raised in lament. Science would attribute such phenomena to the peculiar acoustics of coastal waters, the movement of currents, or simply the human tendency to find patterns in randomness. Yet for those who know the story of the Meridian, the bay holds a different meaning, a reminder that water preserves nothing but secrets. The true horror of what transpired in 1856 lies not in ghostly manifestations or supernatural vengeance, but in the very human capacity for calculated cruelty, for viewing other human beings as cargo, as property, as things to be stolen and hidden away beneath the ground. It lies in the systems that facilitated such atrocities and in the silent complicity that allowed them to fade from memory. In 1966, shortly before her death, Elizabeth Danfield made a final journey to Mobile Bay. A graduate student who accompanied her later recalled that the elderly researcher stood at the shore for nearly an hour, saying nothing. As they were leaving, Danfield stopped at the edge of the old pier and dropped something into the water. When asked what it was, she reportedly said, "A record. Someone should remember they were here." No one knows what document or object Danfield consigned to the waters that day. Like so much else connected to the Meridian, it remains hidden beneath the surface, present but unseen, a truth submerged but never truly gone. For those traveling along the coast south of Mobile, there is a stretch of shoreline where no development stands. Local conservation ordinances protect the area, citing ecological concerns. Maps from the 1960s label it simply as Oyster Point Reserve. Few visitors know its history, and fewer still would connect it to events from 1856. The ground has been reclaimed by coastal vegetation, pine trees and sea oats, concealing whatever might lie beneath. In 1995, a coastal geologist conducting a survey of the area reported anomalies in the soil composition, disturbances inconsistent with natural formations. The findings were noted in an academic paper that received little attention outside specialist circles. The paper's conclusion suggested that extensive subterranean structures of human origin might exist approximately 15 feet below the current surface. No excavation was undertaken, as the area's protected status prevented disruptive research methods. The geologist, Dr. Martin Albrecht, requested permission to conduct a more thorough investigation using ground-penetrating radar. According to departmental records at the University of South Alabama, his request was denied. Dr. Albrecht continued to advocate for further study, citing historical significance. In 1997, he accepted a position at a university in California. Colleagues noted that his departure seemed sudden and uncharacteristic. His research interests subsequently shifted away from coastal geology entirely. Visitors to the area today would find nothing to suggest its dark history. The waters of Mobile Bay lap at a shore that has witnessed centuries of human activity, both mundane and monstrous. The ground underfoot holds its secrets, the soil having long since absorbed whatever evidence might have remained of lives interrupted, of suffering imposed by one man's distorted sense of ownership and control. The story of the Meridian and its missing human cargo represents more than a historical footnote or a macabre tale. It stands as testament to histories deliberately obscured, to atrocities committed not in the grip of supernatural malevolence, but through the cold calculation of human greed. The horror lies not in what might haunt those waters, but in the knowledge that such events could occur within human society, and that evidence of them could be so thoroughly erased from public memory. In 2005, a marine archaeology project mapping shipwrecks in the Gulf of Mexico identified a vessel approximately 30 miles south of Mobile Bay that matched the general description and time period of the Meridian. Initial sonar imaging suggested the ship had been deliberately scuttled, sunk intentionally, rather than lost to storm or structural failure. Plans to investigate the wreck more thoroughly were postponed indefinitely when funding for the project was withdrawn, following changes in departmental priorities. The project director, Dr. Caroline Hayes, noted in her final report that the location of the wreck did not align with any documented shipping routes of the period. The vessel appeared to have been sailing southeast, toward neither New Orleans nor any major port of the time, when it sank. The report concluded with a recommendation for future investigation, suggesting that the wreck might represent a previously undocumented maritime incident of historical significance. Like so many inquiries before it, the recommendation faded into academic obscurity. One more document acknowledging the presence of a mystery without resources to pursue its resolution. Perhaps there is wisdom in allowing some secrets to remain beneath the surface. The full truth of what happened to the Meridian and the 200 souls aboard may never be known with certainty. The chambers beneath Oyster Point have collapsed or been destroyed. The records have disappeared. The last people with even second-hand knowledge of the events died decades ago. What remains is a void in history, an absence of answers that itself testifies to deliberate erasure. Yet absence speaks, silence communicates. The very fact that so little can be known with certainty about the fate of 200 human beings, people with names, histories, relationships, hopes, reveals the profound moral failure of a society that could lose track of them so completely, that could value them so little that their disappearance warranted less concern than the financial loss their absence represented. The waters of Mobile Bay remain opaque, revealing nothing of what may lie beneath. The shore at Oyster Point stands empty, protected now by laws that prevent disturbance of the land for reasons unrelated to its history. And somewhere, perhaps, the remains of those who never completed the Meridian's journey rest in anonymous earth or at the bottom of silent waters, unacknowledged, unmourned, but not entirely forgotten. For in the telling of the story, however incomplete, something of their presence in the world is affirmed. Though we may never know their names or the full measure of what they endured, the acknowledgement that they existed, that their lives mattered, that the wrong done to them deserves remembrance, this itself is a form of belated recognition. It cannot restore what was taken, it cannot right historical wrongs, but perhaps it can ensure that the waters close over them a little less completely, that the silence surrounding their fate becomes a little less absolute. Mobile Bay keeps its secrets, but in the whisper of waves against the shore, in the rustling of wind through coastal pine, there remains the possibility that those who listen closely might hear an echo, not of supernatural presence, but of human history refusing to be entirely erased, not a haunting in the traditional sense, but the persistent memory of lives that deserved better than to vanish without record or reckoning. The story of the Meridian ends not with resolution, but with questions that hang in the air like the Gulf Coast humidity, present, palpable, but impossible to grasp. What became of Captain James Whittaker after his final sighting in New Orleans? What happened in those underground chambers during the 13 months before the storm exposed them? How many of the enslaved individuals survived their captivity, and where did they ultimately go? What documents did Elizabeth Danfield discover that someone felt compelled to remove from the historical record? These questions may never find their answers. The trail has grown too cold, the evidence too scattered or deliberately destroyed. Yet in the absence of certainty, the story persists, passed from researcher to researcher, historian to historian, storyteller to audience, not as supernatural legend, but as a reminder of human capacity for both cruelty and courage, for both the infliction of suffering and the determination to uncover truth. For those who travel along the Gulf Coast, Mobile Bay appears no different from countless other coastal inlets, beautiful, serene, revealing nothing of the histories it has witnessed. The waters show no trace of the Meridian's passage. The shore at Oyster Point bears no marker commemorating those who were held beneath its surface. Time and tide have erased all visible evidence, but for those who know where to look, who understand what transpired there, the landscape itself becomes a text, one that speaks of captivity and concealment, of lives interrupted and histories suppressed. The absence of physical reminder becomes itself a reminder of how thoroughly some stories can be erased when their telling proves inconvenient to those with the power to shape historical memory. The true horror of the Meridian story lies not in ghostly manifestations or supernatural vengeance, but in the mundane reality of human cruelty, and in the systems that facilitated it, the financial incentives that motivated it, and the cultural values that permitted it to occur without meaningful consequence. It lies in the knowledge that similar stories have been enacted throughout human history, some documented and remembered, others lost to deliberate forgetting. When night falls over Mobile Bay and darkness obscures the distinction between water and sky, those familiar with the story might imagine the Meridian making its final voyage, not toward New Orleans as recorded in official documents, but toward the captain's secret destination. They might envision the vessel being emptied under cover of darkness, its human cargo transferred to wagons and transported to the underground chambers prepared for their concealment. They might contemplate the terror and confusion of people already traumatized by enslavement, now subjected to an additional layer of captivity and uncertainty. But such imaginings, however historically informed, remain speculative. The true experiences of those aboard the Meridian died with them. Their stories, like so many others from that terrible period of American history, were never recorded from their perspective. The voices that might have testified to what happened in those chambers were systematically silenced, their narratives deemed unworthy of preservation. In that silence lies perhaps the greatest horror of all, The knowledge that human suffering of immense magnitude could be so thoroughly excised from historical memory, rendered invisible not through supernatural means, but through the all-too-human practices of document destruction, deliberate omission, and institutional indifference. The waters of Mobile Bay continue their eternal rhythm, advancing and retreating with the tides. Beneath their surface, secrets remain, held not by vengeful spirits or cursed objects, but by the simple passage of time and the physical processes of decomposition and sedimentation. The past dissolves literally and figuratively into the elements from which it was formed. What remains is not the past itself, but the story of the past, incomplete, fragmentary, subject to the distortions of perspective and the limitations of evidence. In that story, in its telling and retelling, something of those who vanished aboard the Meridian continues to exist, not as they were in life, but as echoes in human memory. Not as supernatural presences haunting the waters, but as absent centers around which questions of historical responsibility and moral reckoning continue to revolve. For those who stand at the shore of Mobile Bay today, looking out across waters that appear no different from any others along the Gulf Coast, the knowledge of what transpired there serves as reminder that the most profound horrors exist not in the realm of the supernatural, but in the demonstrated capacities of human beings to inflict suffering upon one another, and in the equally human capacity to look away, to forget, to allow such suffering to fade from collective memory. The story of the Meridian offers no neat conclusion, no justice served or lessons definitively learned. It remains, like the waters of Mobile Bay itself, opaque and resistant to final interpretation. What happened beneath the surface, both literally beneath the waters and figuratively beneath the surface of documented history, remains largely unknown. Yet in acknowledging the limits of what can be known, in recognizing the deliberate erasures that have shaped the historical record, we perform an act of remembrance. We affirm that those 200 individuals who disappeared aboard the Meridian were not cargo but people, that their lives mattered, that the wrong done to them deserves acknowledgement even when full reckoning proves impossible. The waters close over them, the earth covers what remains. But in the telling of their story, something of their presence in the world persists, not as ghost or spirit, but as reminder that the past is never truly past, that forgotten histories continue to shape the present in ways both subtle and profound. Mobile Bay keeps its secrets, but we who know its story keep watch, listening for echoes of voices long silenced, affirming through remembrance that no human life should vanish without trace or testimony. In 1968, 1 year after Elizabeth Danfield's death, a collection of papers was donated anonymously to the Alabama State Archives. The materials included fragmentary notes on the Meridian case, though nothing that hadn't already been documented in earlier records. What made the donation notable was a single item, a hand-drawn map, yellowed with age, that appeared to depict the Oyster Point property owned by Thomas Miller. The map showed the layout of underground chambers, with notations indicating capacity, air supply mechanisms, and what appeared to be a schedule for moving groups of people. A notation in the corner read simply, J.W. Blands. The archival staff processed the materials according to standard procedure, cataloguing them for future reference. Within 6 months, however, the map had disappeared from the collection. An internal investigation concluded that it had been misfiled, though the staff member responsible for the collection insisted otherwise. The incident was noted in departmental records, then forgotten as administrative priorities shifted. The remaining Meridian materials were eventually transferred to microfilm, the originals reportedly destroyed due to deterioration, a common practice at the time, though one that rendered authentication of the documents impossible. In 1974, a graduate student researching maritime law came across references to an insurance dispute involving Whitaker and Sons. The documents, preserved in the archives of a New Orleans law firm that had represented maritime insurers in the 19th century, outlined the company's refusal to pay claims on the Meridian. The insurers cited irregularities in the manifest and credible reports that the vessel had been deliberately removed from its intended course. The dispute was eventually settled out of court, with Whitaker and Sons receiving approximately 30% of their claim. What made the discovery significant was a deposition given by a sailor named Samuel Thorne, who claimed to have encountered the Meridian 3 days after its departure from Mobile. According to Thorne's testimony, he observed the vessel anchored in a small cove along the coast, approximately 20 miles southeast of Mobile Bay. Activity on deck suggested the ship was unloading cargo, though the isolated location was not a known port. Thorne reported the sighting upon reaching New Orleans, but authorities dismissed his account, suggesting he had likely observed a different vessel engaged in legitimate business. The graduate student, whose name was redacted from later copies of the research notes, attempted to locate Samuel Thorne's descendants or additional records of his testimony. According to departmental correspondence, the student's academic advisor encouraged them to focus on more productive avenues of research. The student complied, and their final thesis made no mention of the Meridian or Samuel Thorne's testimony. In 1988, a historical novelist researching antebellum maritime commerce discovered correspondence between Charles Whitaker and a business associate in Florida. The letters, preserved in a private collection and made available temporarily for academic research, discussed arrangements for the discreet placement of specialized labor resources over an extended period. The language was deliberately vague, but the timing coincided with the Meridian's disappearance. More significantly, the letters referenced my son's independent enterprise and expressed concern about the sustainability of his methods. The novelist attempted to incorporate these findings into a work of historical fiction based loosely on the Meridian incident. According to publishing industry sources, the manuscript was acquired by a major publishing house, but subsequently cancelled prior to publication. The stated reason was concerns about commercial viability, though individuals familiar with the project suggested that legal concerns had been raised about the depiction of historical figures whose descendants remained socially prominent in the region. In 2010, during digitization of 19th-century court records from Baldwin County, Alabama, a clerk discovered a sealed file related to the Meridian case. The file contained testimony from a witness identified only as M.W., possibly a relation of the Whitaker family, who claimed knowledge of underground structures on the Oyster Point property. According to the testimony, dated 1859, the witness had visited the property at the invitation of James Whitaker, approximately 1 year before the Meridian's disappearance. The witness described seeing preparations for the housing of numerous individuals in concealed chambers, and claimed that Whitaker had spoken openly of a plan to liberate himself from the constraints of commerce through a single bold action. Most disturbing was the witness's claim that Whitaker had conducted what he termed experiments in human endurance on enslaved individuals owned by the family business. Tests designed to determine how many people could be maintained in confined spaces with minimal resources. The witness had apparently come forward after news reports of the chamber's discovery, motivated by what the testimony described as the burden of complicity through silence. The file indicated that the court had taken no action based on the testimony, as the witness was deemed unreliable due to personal circumstances, a common euphemism of the era for individuals suffering from mental illness or substance dependency. The testimony was sealed by judicial order and apparently forgotten until its rediscovery during the digitization process. Within weeks of the file's discovery, the digitization project encountered budgetary issues. The project was temporarily suspended, then restructured with a narrower focus that excluded the relevant time period. The original documents were returned to physical storage, where a subsequent inventory found that the Meridian file was missing. Administrative records indicated it had been removed for conservation assessment, though no department claimed responsibility for its removal. In 2013, a marine archaeologist conducting research unrelated to the Meridian discovered what appeared to be the remains of a small dock structure along an isolated stretch of coastline southeast of Mobile Bay. Carbon dating placed the structure's construction in the mid-19th century. Its location corresponded approximately to the area described in Samuel Thorne's long-forgotten testimony. The archaeologist's report noted that the structure appeared to have been built for temporary use rather than as a permanent installation, with features suggesting it had been designed for rapid loading and unloading of cargo from deep-draft vessels. The report received little attention outside specialist circles, its significance unrecognized by those unfamiliar with the Meridian case. The archaeologist subsequently applied for funding to conduct a more extensive survey of the area, hypothesizing that it might have been used for illegal trafficking in enslaved individuals during the final years before the Civil War. The application was denied due to limited resources and what review committee notes described as insufficient historical context to justify prioritization. Each of these discoveries, the map, the insurance dispute, the private correspondence, the sealed testimony, the dock structure, represents a fragment of a larger picture. Viewed individually, none provides definitive evidence of what happened to the Meridian and its human cargo. Collectively, however, they suggest a narrative far more complex than a simple maritime disappearance, a deliberate conspiracy of theft and concealment, facilitated by social position and financial influence, its traces systematically removed from historical record through a combination of deliberate action and institutional indifference. What emerges is the outline of a crime that would have been extraordinary even by the standards of an era that sanctioned the buying and selling of human beings. Not merely theft of property, though that is how it would have been classified at the time, but the calculated abduction and concealment of 200 individuals for the purpose of private profit, and if the fragmentary evidence is to be believed, for the satisfaction of one man's disturbed fascination with power and control. The full truth of what happened in those underground chambers, how many survived, how many perished, what specific cruelties were inflicted, remains unknown and likely unknowable. The documentary record is too fragmented, too deliberately obscured to support definitive conclusions. What can be said with reasonable certainty is that Captain James Whittaker, using the alias Thomas Miller, diverted the Meridian from its intended course, transported its human cargo to a facility prepared for their concealment, and over the course of approximately 13 months, systematically sold them through private channels for personal profit. That these facts can be assembled at all, despite the passage of time and the apparent efforts to suppress them, testifies to the persistence of historical truth, to the difficulty of completely erasing evidence of even the most carefully concealed atrocities. Documents disappear, witnesses die, physical structures decay or are destroyed, but fragments remain, preserved through chance or oversight, or the occasional courage of individuals like Elizabeth Danfield, who recognize the importance of remembering even the most uncomfortable truths. For those 200 individuals taken aboard the Meridian, historical recognition comes too late to constitute justice. Their suffering cannot be undone. Their losses cannot be restored. Their very identities have been largely erased from the record. What remains is the obligation of remembrance, the recognition that their lives mattered, that the wrongs done to them deserve acknowledgement, that the systems and values that facilitated those wrongs must be understood if similar atrocities are to be prevented in future. The waters of Mobile Bay reveal nothing of what lies beneath their surface. The shore at Oyster Point stands empty, its underground chambers collapsed or destroyed, their contents long since removed. The wreck of the Meridian, if indeed it is the vessel identified by sonar imaging, remains unexplored on the floor of the Gulf of Mexico. The documentary evidence exists primarily as absence, files removed, testimonies sealed, inquiries abandoned. Yet the story persists. Not as ghost tale or supernatural legend, but as historical question, as moral reckoning, as reminder that the past is never truly past. The horror of the Meridian lies not in spectral manifestations or paranormal vengeance, but in the documented capacity of human beings to inflict calculated suffering on others, and in the equally documented tendency of social and governmental institutions to look away, to prioritize stability and commerce over justice, to allow even the most monstrous crimes to fade from memory when their acknowledgement proves inconvenient. In 2016, a coastal geologist conducting routine surveys along the Mobile Bay shoreline noted anomalies in soil composition near the former site of Oyster Point. Ground-penetrating radar revealed structures approximately 15 feet below the surface, voids in the earth that corresponded in size and arrangement to the underground chambers described in historical accounts. The geologist, unaware of the site's history, reported the findings as possible karst formations, naturally occurring underground spaces created by the dissolution of limestone. A local historian familiar with the Meridian case recognized the significance of the location and attempted to secure permission for archaeological investigation. The application was denied due to the area's protected status and what county officials described as insufficient historical justification. The historian's subsequent appeals were unsuccessful, though they attracted brief attention from regional media outlets. Public interest proved transient, and within months the matter had faded from local discourse. The site remains undisturbed, protected now by environmental regulations unrelated to its historical significance. The chambers beneath the surface, if indeed they are the same structures described in 19th century accounts, continue their slow collapse, compressed by the weight of earth and time. Whatever evidence they might contain of the Meridian's human cargo lies beyond reach, preserved only in the fragmented documentary record and in the persistent efforts of those who believe that historical truth deserves recognition, regardless of its inconvenience or the discomfort it may cause. For those who know the story, Mobile Bay is not merely a geographical feature, but a historical text, one whose full meaning remains partially obscured, its most significant passages submerged or erased. The waters reveal nothing of the Meridian's final voyage, of Captain James Whittaker's calculated betrayal, of the terror experienced by those transported from the vessel to underground confinement. The shore offers no memorial to those who suffered there, no acknowledgement of historical wrongs that have never been fully addressed. Yet, in the telling and retelling of the story, in the persistent efforts to assemble fragments into coherent narrative, something of those lost lives is affirmed. Not their full humanity, that cannot be recovered from a historical record that systematically denied it, but at least the recognition that they existed, that they suffered, that the wrong done to them deserves remembrance. The waters of Mobile Bay continue their eternal rhythm, advancing and retreating with the tides. Beneath their surface, secrets remain, held not by supernatural forces, but by the simple passage of time and the physical processes of decay and sedimentation. The past dissolves, literally and figuratively, into the elements from which it was formed. What remains is not the past itself, but the obligation to remember, to acknowledge, to learn from even the darkest chapters of human history. For in that remembrance lies the possibility, however fragile, that similar atrocities might be prevented in future, that the capacity for cruelty documented in the Meridian case might be recognized and countered before it manifests in new forms of exploitation and abuse. The horror of the past serves not merely to disturb, but to instruct, not merely to haunt, but to warn. Mobile Bay keeps its secrets, but those who know its history keep watch, listening for echoes of voices long silenced, affirming through remembrance that no human life should vanish without trace or testimony. In that vigilance, in that commitment to historical truth, however uncomfortable, lies the closest approximation of justice that can be offered to those who disappeared aboard the Meridian in the distant autumn of 1856. A recognition, belated but sincere, that they were not cargo but people, that their lives mattered, that the wrong done to them deserves acknowledgement even when full reckoning proves impossible. The waters close over them. The earth covers what remains. But in the telling of their story, something of their presence in the world persists, not as ghost or spirit, but as reminder that the past is never truly past, that forgotten histories continue to shape the present in ways both subtle and profound. That reminder, that obligation to remember, to acknowledge, to learn, is the legacy of the Meridian and its vanished human cargo, a legacy that endures long after the physical traces of their passage have been erased from the visible landscape. In that remembrance, in that commitment to historical truth, the waters of Mobile Bay become more than mere geography. They become testament to the persistence of memory, to the difficulty of completely erasing even the most carefully concealed atrocities, to the moral necessity of confronting the darkest chapters of human history, not with supernatural explanation, but with the more difficult recognition of documented human capacity for calculated cruelty, and with the equally important recognition of human capacity for courage, for witness, for the preservation of truths that others would prefer to forget. The story of the Meridian offers no neat conclusion, no justice served or lessons definitively learned. It remains, like the waters of Mobile Bay itself, opaque and resistant to final interpretation. What happened beneath the surface, both literally beneath the waters and figuratively beneath the surface of documented history, remains largely unknown. Yet in acknowledging the limits of what can be known, in recognizing the deliberate erasures that have shaped the historical record, we perform an act of remembrance. We affirm that those 200 individuals who disappeared aboard the Meridian were not cargo but people, that their lives mattered, that the wrong done to them deserves acknowledgement even when full reckoning proves impossible. In that act of remembrance, in that commitment to historical truth, however incomplete, lies the closest approximation of justice that can be offered across the gulf of centuries. A recognition, belated but sincere, that no human life should vanish without trace or testimony, that no atrocity should be allowed to fade completely from collective memory, that the obligation to remember extends even to those whose names have been lost to deliberate erasure. The waters of Mobile Bay continue their eternal rhythm, advancing and retreating with the tides. Beneath their surface, secrets remain. But for those who know the story of the Meridian, who have assembled the fragments into narrative, who have recognized the significance of what has been lost or deliberately obscured, those waters speak of more than natural processes. They speak of human history in all its complexity, of cruelty and courage, of atrocity and witness, of the difficulty but ultimate necessity of confronting even the darkest chapters of the past. For in that confrontation, in that refusal to look away from documented horror, lies the possibility of learning, of change, of ensuring that similar atrocities do not recur. The waters close over the Meridian and its human cargo. Time erases physical traces, but memory persists, fragmentary but essential, a reminder that the past is never truly past, that forgotten histories continue to shape the present in ways both subtle and profound. Mobile Bay keeps its secrets, but we who know its story keep watch, listening for echoes of voices long silenced, affirming through remembrance that no human life should vanish without trace or testimony.